Have you ever noticed how the quietest moments often hold the loudest truths? Sometimes, it's not the answers that transform us, but the stillness between questions. In a world that rushes toward resolution, we invite you to pause, breathe, and enter a space where stories unfold like falling leaves, slowly, gently, and with meaning that lingers. Welcome to Cosmic Zodiac, where ancient Zen wisdom meets the everyday. In this series of 10 small but profound stories, each tale carries a whisper of the Dharma, carefully hidden within the lives of ordinary people navigating uncertainty, love, regret, and awakening. So, before we begin, I'd love for you to take a breath and leave a comment sharing, where are you listening from right now? What time is it there as you hear this story? Whether you're in a small town at 4 in the morning or a city balcony just after sunset, your presence adds to this quiet circle. And if this kind of peaceful reflection resonates with you, tap the like button, subscribe to Cosmic Zodiac, and join us on this mindful journey through 100 Zen stories. One breath, one lesson, one story at a time. Walter Ellsworth had lived in Willow Glen Retirement Home for 3 years. At 81, he was one of its quietest residents, a man of few complaints and even fewer visitors. His once thick silver hair had thinned to wisps. His posture had curved inward like a closing flower, and his voice had the soft huskiness of one who'd long since lost the need to be heard. But his memory, unlike his knees or his grip, was still sharp. Sharp enough to remember details, names of soldiers under his command, the exact date his wife passed, and the firm but fading scent of cedar from the pillow he brought with him the day he moved in. The pillow was unremarkable to anyone else. Rectangular, light blue, a stitched hem slightly frayed at one corner. But to Walter, it was sacred, not because of the pillow itself, but because it had cradled his wife's head during the final year of her illness, when he'd held her hand through long nights of pain and whispered old love songs into the silence. After she died, he'd slept on it every night, still on the right side of the bed, as if leaving room for her ghost. Willow Glen was quiet in February. The air was crisp, but lazy. Trees bare and unmoving, as if even nature had given in to the slow rhythm of aging. Residents came and went through routine breakfast at 7, puzzles by 9, communal television by 2, then dinner and soft jazz until sleep arrived. Walter liked the order. It was dependable. In a world where so much had been lost, his wife, his strength, his sense of urgency, he clung to little things like routine and that old blue pillow. So when he returned to his room one Thursday afternoon, after his usual stroll around the koi pond, he noticed it instantly. His pillow was missing. At first, he blinked, unsure. The beds were made tightly tucked, but the pillow now on his mattress was pale cream, stiff, synthetic, not his. He reached down, touched it, sniffed the fabric. His heart began to race, not in panic, but in outrage. Walter's hands trembled as he backed out of the room and shuffled quickly, too quickly, for his legs to the other side of the suite. He banged twice on the door of room 214 and entered without waiting for a response. Jack was there, lying on his bed, arms crossed behind his head, gazing out the window with a look of tired contentment. Jack had moved in only 3 weeks prior, a former gym teacher with large hands and a voice that still carried like a whistle. He had bad knees and a worse temper. But lately, he'd been gentler, quieter. Walter hadn't decided whether that was peace or exhaustion. Walter's voice cracked as he barked. "What do you think you're doing with my pillow?" Jack blinked. "What?" "That's my pillow." Walter pointed. "Blue, cotton, slight fray on the left. That's mine." Jack sat up slowly. "I didn't take any pillow. The nurse brought it in earlier. Said she switched linens." "She switched linens, not identities." Walter snapped. "That pillow's been with me for over 20 years. 20 years. Jack raised his hand slightly, like a man trying not to provoke a dog. "Look, I don't know what happened. If it's yours, take it. I don't need any trouble." Walter stared at him, throat tightening. Something in Jack's face was too calm, too casual. The sight of that pillow, his pillow under someone else's head, ignited something hot and fast inside him. He snatched it up, pressing it to his chest as if shielding a wounded bird. Then he turned and walked out, breath short, temples pulsing. Back in his room, Walter sat on the edge of his bed, holding the pillow like an old photograph. He muttered under his breath, "People have no respect, no memory, no sense of place. What kind of man uses another man's pillow without asking, his fingers clenched around the fabric?" And yet, the more he stared at it, the more a strange unease set in. The scent was faint, unfamiliar. The stitching was different. He turned it over. The fray wasn't on the left, it was on the right. Walter's hand dropped to his lap. He looked around the room, opened the closet, checked the laundry basket. His pillow, his real pillow, wasn't here. A knock sounded at the door. It was Nurse Annie, her soft ponytail bouncing slightly with each step, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Ellsworth?" She smiled. "Everything okay?" Walter stared at her. Did you change our linens today?" "Yes. We always do Thursday swaps." "Did something happen, I think? I think you might have switched our pillows." Annie's face fell. "Oh no. Oh my goodness. I must have Jack's bedding had a note about a new pillow due to his neck pain. And I probably mixed yours during laundry sorting. I'm so sorry." Walter looked down at the pillow, still in his hands. I yelled at him. Annie blinked. I accused him, made a fool of myself, all over a pillow I didn't even bother to really look at. She stepped closer, kneeling beside his bed. "Mr. Ellsworth, do you want me to get your original pillow? It's probably still in the cart downstairs." Walter exhaled slowly. "No. Leave it." That night, Walter lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the wrong pillow under his neck. Though somehow, it didn't feel wrong anymore. Not because it was comfortable, it wasn't, but because his mind wouldn't stop turning over something else entirely. How many times in his life had he done that? Reacted swiftly, assumed, accused, especially when he was younger, when he was in uniform. A soldier's training wasn't built on patience. It was built on instinct, speed, assertion. He remembered barking orders, yelling at privates, losing his temper over mud on boots and late formations. He thought of his son, how many fights they had over the years, the time he accused him of being careless with his mother's medicine, when in truth, he'd misunderstood the dosage instructions. They hadn't spoken for 6 months after that. Walter turned onto his side, face pressing into the cotton. He imagined the pillow as a boat drifting. Who was he to claim ownership of something so simple, so transient? In the silence, the memory of a Zen saying came to mind, one he had read long ago in the waiting room of his wife's hospital. You will not be punished for your anger. You will be punished by your anger. He whispered the words aloud, then closed his eyes. The next morning, Walter rose early. It had snowed overnight. A thin layer of powder glistened on the garden bench outside the window. The sky was lavender gray. He made his bed neatly, folded his pajamas, and tucked the cream pillow under his arm. He knocked softly on Jack's door. Jack opened it slowly, face half-shaved, eyes wary. "I brought it back," Walter said. Jack looked down at the pillow. "I was wrong," Walter said, "and rude." Jack scratched his chin. "It happens." Walter nodded. "Still, I wanted to say it." Jack stepped aside, letting Walter into the room. The two men sat for a while without speaking. Just the hum of the heater and the distant chirp of birds returning after a quiet winter. "You know," Jack said at last, "I've been yelling in my sleep again. I heard it last night. Scared myself awake." Walter turned. "Dreams," Jack shrugged. "Old stuff. Stuff I thought I buried." Walter nodded slowly. "Me too." The heater clicked softly. "I guess we're all carrying things," Jack said. "Even when we think we've put them down." Walter let out a breath, not quite a sigh, but close. Maybe we carry what we haven't forgiven. Others, or ourselves. Jack's eyes narrowed slightly. "You Buddhist or something?" Walter smiled faintly. "My wife was... I was a hard-shelled military man, but after she passed, I started reading what she used to read. Zen books, meditation. I didn't understand it at first. Still don't. Most days." Jack chuckled. "A lot of things I don't understand. Like why something so small, like a damn pillow, can stir up so much." "Because it's never about the pillow," Walter said. "It's about what we're already holding." Jack leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "You think people ever stop holding stuff?" Walter thought about it. "Maybe not. But I think we can learn to set things down, at least for a while." Outside the window, a small bird landed on the snowy branch of a pine. It fluttered once, then stilled body rising and falling with breath. Jack watched it, eyes softening. Walter stood to leave. He placed the cream pillow gently on the dresser, then paused at the door. "Do you need the blue one back?" he asked. Jack shook his head. "Nah, keep it. It smells like you anyway." Walter laughed, a rare, creaky thing that surprised even him. As he returned to his room, something in his chest had shifted. Not released, not completely, but loosened. He opened his window a crack and let the cold air in, just enough to feel it sting. Then he sat and breathed. Just him, just the pillow, just this moment. And somehow, that was enough. The next morning came with a breath of spring, still hiding beneath a winter chill. Outside the windows of Willow Glen Retirement Home, patches of frost clung to garden benches, while soft bluebirds stirred restlessly in bare-branched trees. The light was pale and forgiving, and the sky opened just wide enough to let something new in. A few doors down from Walter's room, where the air still carried a trace of cedar and silence. Clara Montgomery stirred her morning tea with the slow, habitual grace of someone who no longer rushed for anything. At 78, Clara had mastered the art of stillness, not because she wanted to, but because life had peeled away so many of the noises she used to chase. She sat by the window of her small apartment, the cup cradled in both hands, elbows resting on the wool throw that always lay folded over the sill. Her hair, once thick and the color of sand, had settled into a soft cloud of silver that she twisted into a clip each morning. She wore the same cardigan almost every day, not out of necessity, but because it held something of her late husband's scent so faint, now she wondered if she only imagined it. The room was filled with gentle light, filtered through linen curtains. Photos of her family lined the shelves, some framed neatly, others tucked behind knickknacks. But her eyes rarely lingered on them. What she returned to, again and again, was the small, leather-bound recipe journal resting on the far end of her kitchen counter. It was a modest thing, about the size of her hand, with pages browned at the edges and smudged with flower fingerprints from decades past. It had been George's, her husband, a man with large shoulders, quiet eyes, and a strange love for baking. Not cooking, just baking. Pies, in particular. His apple pie had once won a county fair, though he'd never stopped saying it was too sweet and needed more bite. He baked every Sunday, like clockwork. 3 people, sharp, whether there were guests or just the two of them. That scent, cinnamon, browned butter, baked apples cooled just enough to slice, had become a part of her skin. It had also disappeared the day he died. She hadn't touched the oven since. 7 years. That afternoon, her grandson, Tommy, arrived from Vermont, fresh off spring break and still wearing his oversized hoodie like armor. He was 14, eyes glued to his phone, and his presence filled the room like a sudden gust of young wind in an old house. "Hi, Grandma," he muttered, pulling his backpack onto the armchair. Clara smiled and patted the seat beside her. "Come sit." He slouched beside her, glancing out the window. "Smells nice in here, like pie." She blinked. "What, I swear I smell it. Like apple pie or something. You baking." She hadn't baked in 7 years. She looked toward the kitchen, heart fluttering strangely. The stove sat cold, untouched. No scent lingered in the air. And yet, "No, darling," she said softly. "Not in a long time." Tommy wrinkled his nose. "Huh, weird. It's like familiar, kinda warm." She didn't answer. A sudden swell of feeling pressed against her chest. Not grief exactly, but something deeper, older, like memory breathing. That night, she lay awake long after Tommy had fallen asleep on the couch. She could hear his soft snoring, the hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of wind against the window pane. But beneath all of that, she heard something else. The sound of a wooden spoon knocking gently against a ceramic bowl. It wasn't real. She knew that, but it was vivid. She rose slowly, bare feet cool against the tile, and crossed the room to the kitchen. Her hand hovered above the oven dial, hesitant. Her fingers trembled as if reaching through time itself. Then she turned the dial. The oven ticked awake. She retrieved the recipe book, opened to the dog-eared page labeled in George's handwriting, Sunday apple pie. She could almost hear his voice reading the instructions, not out loud, but in the way memories speak when they aren't asked to. She gathered the ingredients one by one, guided by muscle memory. Apples, peeled and sliced, brown sugar, butter, nutmeg, a pinch of salt, a squeeze of lemon. Her hands moved carefully, almost ceremonially, as if performing a ritual. The crust was always the trickiest. George used to hum while kneading it, a low, tuneless melody that filled the kitchen like steam. Clara didn't hum, but her breath fell into rhythm. In, out, press, fold, roll. When the pie finally went into the oven, she sat down in silence, watching the orange glow from behind the glass. And then the smell began to rise. It didn't rush, it unfolded. Soft, slow, warm, cinnamon first, then baked fruit, a whisper of sugar over fire. The aroma moved through the apartment, like a familiar guest, returning after a long journey. Tommy woke up, rubbing his eyes. Grandma. She turned. I made pie. He blinked. What now? She smiled. Yes, now. He sat beside her on the floor, cross-legged, both of them watching the oven. For a moment, time folded in on itself. There was no yesterday, no next week, just the quiet heat of shared presence. Did Grandpa make this? He asked. He used to. Why'd you stop? She was quiet a moment. Because when someone leaves, sometimes we freeze everything around them, afraid to move in case we lose them again. But you didn't lose him. Clara turned to him, eyes moist. No, not tonight. They ate the pie warm, plates balanced on their laps, steam curling into the soft light of the lamp beside the couch. She chewed slowly, eyes closing between bites. The crust was imperfect, the filling slightly uneven. But the flavor carried her, not backward, but inward. Later, after Tommy had gone to sleep again, she washed the dishes carefully, her hands warm and wrinkled under the tap. Then she stood at the sink, staring out into the darkness beyond the glass. A memory rose, unbidden. Years ago, she'd asked George during one of his quiet baking Sundays why he always seemed so content while he cooked. He'd said, "Because this is the only place I know where time doesn't matter, where I don't worry about the world, or what it wants. Just butter and sugar and breath." She hadn't understood then, but she did now. She walked over to the window, opened it slightly, and let the cool night air in. The scent of apples drifted out like a prayer. The next morning, Clara woke before sunrise. She brewed tea, sliced the leftover pie, and placed 2 pieces on the table, one for her, one for George. She didn't speak, didn't pray, just sat in Zen practice. There's a word, shikantaza, just sitting, not to gain anything, not to fix, just to be. Clara didn't know the term, but she understood the feeling. Later that week, she joined the Wednesday meditation group in the garden room. She didn't say much, only bowed slightly to the instructor and sat near the window. When the session ended, the teacher approached her gently. First time Clara nodded. "What brought you here?" She thought for a moment, then said, "A pie." The instructor smiled, not pressing further. In the following weeks, Clara kept baking, not every day, just now and then. Her pies became known around Willow Glen not for their perfection, but for the way they made the air smell like childhood. Residents lingered longer in the hallways. Nurses smiled more. And in the shared dining room, people started talking again. One afternoon, Walter passed by her table and said, "Smells like your cooking time itself." Clara laughed, only catching it while it's warm. But underneath the lightness, something steady had taken root. Because Clara wasn't baking to remember George anymore. She was baking to remember herself, to taste again the texture of the present, to offer warmth without reason, to breathe in the sweetness of now. To those listening to you, perhaps you've also held back something because it hurt too much to feel it. Perhaps you've closed a window inside your heart, afraid of what might drift in if you opened it again. But maybe the scent of what you love is still lingering, waiting, not behind you, not lost, but here, in this breath, in this moment, in your hands. You don't have to make a pie. You only have to listen to the quiet knocking of memory, to the rise of warmth when you pause long enough to notice, to the softness that returns when you let go of the story that says, never again. This too is practice. This too is Zen. The days at Willow Glen moved with an almost sacred stillness now. Each hour leaned softly into the next, like ripples on a quiet lake. Some days smelled like cinnamon and pie crust, others like old books and fabric softener. And some days like this one carried the scent of pine shavings and varnish. It came from the edge of the garden courtyard, where a small wooden shed had stood for years, mostly unused. Lately, though, it had become a kind of sanctuary. And inside it, George Halloran had reclaimed something he thought he had long since put away. George was 76, tall but slightly hunched from decades of leaning over workbenches. His hands bore the marks of a life with tools, knuckles thickened by time, fingertips calloused from years of sanding, carving, mending. He had been a carpenter all his life, built cradles and coffins, cabinets and stairways. And once, long ago, he had built a bow, not the kind you tie with ribbon, but a long, curved piece of ash wood with a single strand of sinew pulled taut across its frame. A hunting bow, one that took precision, patience, and balance to shape. He'd made it in his early 20s, when ambition had filled his chest like a fire. He had learned the craft from his father, and his father from his own before that. But archery had been his, not for killing, for stillness, for the way it made the world narrow into a single point of presence. He hadn't drawn that bow in over 40 years. It had sat in a velvet-lined case beneath his bed, untouched. But something in the rhythm of Clara's baking, of Walter's softened voice in the hallway, of the way spring had begun to unfold in tiny crocuses along the stone path, something had stirred him. That morning, he'd pulled the bow from its case. His hands had trembled as he held it, not from weakness, but from reverence. The curve had aged well, smooth and sure, but it felt foreign, like meeting a friend you had once known deeply, now grown older and unfamiliar. He sat with it in the shed, letting the weight of it settle into his palms. The bow wasn't just wood, it was memory. It was the echo of breath, held between tension and release. He remembered the way his father used to say, "Don't aim with your eyes. Aim with the part of you that listens before it speaks." That afternoon, there was a flyer on the community board, Spring Festival Talent Day. Residents were invited to perform or showcase something from their past music, poetry, even woodworking. Someone had scribbled in the margins, "Archery Demo." George stared at the note for a long time. That evening, he walked to the shed with a single target painted onto cardboard and a handful of old arrows he'd saved for no real reason. He set the target against the garden wall and paced backward, counting off steps on the uneven stone. His heart pounded as he notched the first arrow. His breath caught halfway between inhale and fear. When he released the string, the arrow sailed off to the left, burying itself in the dirt. He stood frozen. It wasn't the miss that startled him. It was what rose within him the moment he'd missed the wave of shame. Not anger, not frustration, but a dull echo of something older, the sense that he had failed not only at hitting a mark, but at being the man he once was. He tried again. The second arrow struck the edge of the cardboard and bounced off. The third landed near his feet. He dropped the bow. Later that night, he sat outside the shed in silence, the sky above fading from indigo to velvet. In the far distance, he could hear laughter from the lounge, where other residents were playing cards and watching a sitcom. But George didn't move. His hands lay on his knees, palms facing upward. A memory floated to him, then one he hadn't thought of in years, sitting beside his daughter, Emily, on the back porch when she was 11. She'd just lost a spelling bee and was furious with herself. "I didn't even get close," she had said, tears in her throat. He remembered replying, "It doesn't always matter where the arrow lands. What matters is whether you let go without flinching." He had forgotten that until now. The next morning, George skipped breakfast and returned to the shed before the sun had warmed the earth. He stood barefoot on the cool flagstones, bow in hand, eyes soft. He didn't notch an arrow this time. He just stood and breathed. He remembered a line from a Zen book his wife once gave him, years ago, when she was still alive, still laughing at his quiet ways. When the archer becomes the bow, and the bow becomes the arrow, and the arrow becomes the target, then, and only then, is there no fear. He let that sink in. He realized that all those years ago, when he shot with ease, he had never been trying to hit anything. He had simply been in relationship with the wind, with the wood, with his own presence. Somewhere along the way, he had traded that for performance, and performance for identity. And now, as he stood in the early light of the garden, he saw the truth he had been afraid not of missing. He had been afraid of being seen missing. The fear wasn't in his hands. It was in his ego. That afternoon, George walked to the bulletin board and wrote beneath the Spring Festival Talent Day flyer, "Archery Demo. Come watch an old man aim at nothing." On the day of the festival, folding chairs lined the garden path. Residents shuffled in with light sweaters, sun hats, and curiosity. Clara brought a small plate of lemon cookies. Walter, standing with a cane now, smiled softly from the second row. George stepped forward slowly, bow in hand. He looked out at the group, Then at the target, a simple paper circle pinned to the old oak. He said nothing. He notched the arrow, exhaled, and drew the bowstring. But just before releasing it, he lowered the bow and laughed. "I can't do it," he said. Some residents looked confused. Others leaned forward. "I can shoot it, but not like this." He paused. "I've realized something this past week. Something important. I've been afraid of looking like a man who can't do what he used to." He held the bow up. "But this isn't who I used to be. This is what connects me to now, to this breath, to this quiet, to this body that still tries." He turned, not toward the target, but toward the trees. He faced a spot with no mark at all. Then, with steady hands, he drew the bow and released. The arrow disappeared into the distance, lost in the branches. Silence. Then, applause. Not because he had hit something, but because he had let go. Later, sitting beside Clara and Walter, under the shade of the magnolia tree, George passed around cookies and smiled quietly. Clara asked, "You ever going to aim at a real target again?" George shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not." Walter chuckled. "You aimed at something better today." George nodded, sipping his lemonade. "No more proving," he said, just breathing. And so it was that in a garden, where time moved slowly, and the air held the scent of old wood and lemon zest, a man laid down the burden of who he thought he had to be, and picked up the joy of being. And perhaps, just perhaps, there's something in that for all of us. A reminder that whatever we're holding too tightly, whether it's the need to succeed, the fear of being judged, or the image of who we once were, we can breathe into it, soften our grip, and let it fly. Not toward a target, but toward freedom. The soft rustle of cherry blossoms in the garden became a familiar sound at Willow Glen as April slowly unwrapped herself in shades of moss green and early pink. After George's quiet demonstration with the old bow, something invisible had shifted among the residents, not loudly, but like a whisper carried on the surface of warm tea. People smiled more, lingered longer after breakfast, and even sat together in silence without the need to fill it. It was during one such quiet morning that Sister Evelyn arrived. She wasn't a nun in the traditional sense. Not anymore. Her long robes were the color of wet stone, and her sandals had worn thin across the soles. Her head was shaved clean, and her face bore the calm of one who had walked through many storms and no longer braced against the rain. She had once served at a Zen retreat center up in Mendocino County, but now, nearing 70, she traveled from place to place in quiet offering. Willow Glen was her latest stop. No one invited her. No one had to. She came in with the rain. The day she arrived, the sky had begun weeping just after dawn, thin, needling rain that whispered through the pine needles and ran in soft rivulets across the window panes. Sister Evelyn entered the front hall with no umbrella, no suitcase, just a canvas satchel, her robe soaked through and clinging to her arms like petals. Clara, now spending more time in the communal areas, offered her a towel and a cup of tea. Sister Evelyn accepted both with a small bow and settled into the chair near the window, facing the garden with her palms open on her lap. She didn't say much. Not then. It wasn't until later that week, during a group tea gathering in the common room that she told a story, not about herself, not at first. She told it as if it had happened to someone else, somewhere else. But everyone listening knew, somehow, that it was hers. She began like this. There were once two monks walking down a narrow forest path, their robes soaked by rain, their sandals slapping against the muddy trail. The sky hung low and gray, and the branches above offered little shelter. Up ahead, the road dipped into a shallow river crossing, now flooded from the morning storm. A young woman in a silk kimono stood at the edge, shivering. She looked helpless and lost, unable to cross without soaking herself completely. The older monk, without hesitation, stepped into the water and offered his hand. Without a word, he lifted her gently onto his back and carried her across. On the far bank, he set her down, bowed briefly, and continued on. The younger monk said nothing. For miles, they walked in silence. Then suddenly, the younger one stopped and said, "How could you do that? We've taken vows. You touched a woman. You carried her in your arms." The elder monk turned, eyes soft. "I put her down miles ago," he said. "Why are you still carrying her?" There was a long pause after the story ended. The room seemed to lean inward. Clara's fingers tightened slightly around her teacup. Walter, sitting in the corner, nodded once and looked down. George looked out the window toward the trees swaying gently in the rain. Sister Evelyn took a sip of tea, then added, "Sometimes we carry what no longer exists, simply because we haven't noticed we're still holding it." That evening, Clara found herself lingering in the kitchen longer than usual. Her hands rinsing the same plate twice, she kept seeing the woman in the silk kimono, the way the elder monk had simply acted without judgment, without resistance, and let go just as easily. She thought about George's arrow disappearing into the woods. She thought about her own grip, how tightly she had clung to grief for years, afraid that setting it down meant letting go of love itself. But Evelyn's story had stirred something, not an answer, a question. And that night, sleep came more softly. The next morning, Sister Evelyn invited anyone interested to join her for a walking meditation along the gravel paths outside. Only a few showed up: Clara, George, a quiet man named Ben, and a nurse named Abby, who had never meditated but said she was curious. Evelyn didn't give a lecture. She simply removed her sandals and stood barefoot on the damp stones. "We'll walk slowly," she said. "Just notice the contact between your feet and the earth. Don't chase any thoughts. Don't push them away. Just walk. Just breathe." And so they walked, in a long, slow line around the garden's perimeter. The sky had dried to a soft silver, and the smell of wet grass hung in the air like a memory. Clara felt her body resist at first. She wanted to move faster. Her mind reached forward to the next turn, to what they might say after, to whether she was doing it right. But gradually, as they circled the fountain, something within her let go. Each step became just that, a step. Each breath, its own world. She felt the crunch of stone, the cold seeping through her soles, the gentle swing of her arms. She felt the wind move through the sleeve of her cardigan. She noticed a robin watching her from a low branch, and for a moment, she wasn't Clara the widow or Clara the grandmother. She was simply walking. When the meditation ended, Evelyn bowed slightly to the group and said nothing more. There was no praise, no commentary, just the quiet rhythm of being. But later, in a one-on-one conversation, Clara asked her something she'd never said out loud. How do you let go of guilt that has shaped your entire life? Evelyn tilted her head. Guilt. Clara nodded. When George was sick, I wanted to be stronger, more patient. I wasn't always. Some days I felt numb. I'd pretend not to hear him calling for water because I was just tired. And now, even after all these years, I still feel like I failed him. Evelyn was quiet for a long while. Then she said, "Do you know what it means when the Buddha says, 'Drop it'?" Clara didn't answer. It doesn't mean pretending something didn't happen. Evelyn continued. It means letting go of the version of the past that you're still fighting against. It means understanding that you, too, were a person doing the best you could with a breaking heart. It means offering yourself the same compassion you'd give a stranger. Clara's eyes welled up, but how Evelyn took a breath, by noticing, over and over. Each time the thought arises, see it, name it, bow to it gently, and let it pass, like a bird crossing the sky. Clara sat with that, and for the first time, something inside her loosened, not in a dramatic way, not like chains falling, but like a window cracking open just enough to let in spring. That night, rain returned, a soft pattering on the rooftop, like the slow heartbeat of the earth. George sat beneath the awning outside, sipping warm cider, listening. Evelyn joined him. He didn't speak at first, neither did she. Then he asked, "Did you ever make mistakes you couldn't fix?" She smiled. "Of course." He nodded, staring into the night. "I used to think I had to repair everything I ever broke." Evelyn looked at him gently. "And now?" He shrugged. "Now I'm learning to sit beside the cracks." She reached into her satchel and pulled out a tiny piece of pottery. A teacup, chipped and imperfect, but repaired with delicate veins of gold. "Kintsugi," she said, "Japanese art of mending broken things with gold. They believe the break becomes part of the beauty." George turned the cup over in his hand. "What if you're the one who broke it? Then all the more reason to hold it with care." A breeze lifted the edge of Evelyn's robe, carrying the scent of earth and wet pine. In the weeks that followed, more residents began to join her morning meditations, not because they understood Zen or had read the sutras, but because they felt something in her presence, an invitation to stop struggling for a moment and simply be. Clara baked more. But now she shared her pies, not in memory of George, but as an act of kindness in the present. Walter spent more time outdoors, watching birds. Even Nurse Abby started pausing in the stairwell each day for 3 deep breaths before continuing her shift. The rain came and went, but the stillness remained. One afternoon, a group sat together under the blooming magnolia tree. Someone asked Evelyn what the most important teaching she had ever received was. She thought for a moment, then replied, "A teacher once told me, enlightenment is not some grand event. It's noticing the sound of rain without wishing it would stop." The group fell quiet, and in that silence, a soft drizzle began to fall through the blossoms above. No one moved to go inside. They just listened to the rain, to the breath, to the gentle reminder that peace doesn't come from fixing what's broken, but from letting things be exactly as they are wet, blooming, fragile, and beautiful. And perhaps, if we are willing, we can do the same, not by understanding everything, not by changing the past, but by choosing, moment by moment, to stop carrying what no longer needs to be held. So the next time it rains, let it. Let it fall on your shoulders, soft and cool. And instead of rushing for cover, maybe you'll pause and remember the story of the woman in the rain. Even as the last blossoms of the magnolia tree fell silently onto the damp stone path, far away from Willow Glen, in a quiet Colorado valley where the sky opened wide over fields of juniper and brush pine, a different kind of stillness was being tested. The town of Ridgetop wasn't much more than a few weathered houses, a gas pump that hadn't worked since 2009, and a general store with a faded open sign that swayed against the wind. At the heart of it stood the old post office, white siding chipped with time, windows clouded from decades of dust, and a single wooden bench out front that bore the weight of both time and talk. Inside, Samuel Ridge, 68, sat behind the sorting desk as he had done nearly every weekday for the past 21 years. He was a man of firm shoulders and slow gestures. His hair had thinned, but not grayed entirely, and he wore his flannel shirts tucked with the discipline of a man who once tried to be something else. The post office was more than his job. It was his rhythm. It was his excuse not to leave. That morning, the wind carried a strange dryness, and the sun peeked between cotton clouds like a hesitant guest. Samuel unlocked the front door, precisely at 8 Mahim, as he always did, turning the brass key twice and giving the doorframe a slight shoulder push, because it stuck when the air was dry. He placed the bin of sorted mail on the front counter and waited. Ridgetop didn't get much traffic. The mail was mostly routine government envelopes, catalogs, the occasional birthday card. But today, there was a package, square, plain, no return address, postmarked from Arizona. His name, Samuel Ridge, was written in familiar handwriting. He stared at it for a long time, motionless. Then he slid it under the counter and resumed work, though his hands trembled slightly as he sorted flyers from letters. An hour passed before he reopened the box. Inside was a smaller envelope, and beneath it, something wrapped in an old handkerchief. He opened the envelope first. It was a letter, brief, written in the tight, slanted script he hadn't seen in over 30 years. "Sam, I'm sorry I left like that. I never stopped thinking about you. I didn't expect forgiveness, but I still wanted to send this. You don't have to keep it. Eli." He let out a breath. He didn't realize he'd been holding. Beneath the note, carefully wrapped, was a small carved statue. It was simple as a sparrow, perched on a slender post, wings slightly spread. He had seen it before. He had carved it himself when he was 17, given it to Eli on the night they had shared their last conversation, or rather, their last argument. Eli, his brother, half-brother, technically, but that distinction had only mattered after the shouting began, after their father died. after the will divided the house and land unevenly, after Samuel had accused Eli of not being real family. The statue had been thrown back at him during that last exchange, dropped on the dirt floor of the barn, its wing chipped in the corner. Now, all these years later, Eli had sent it back. Samuel didn't know what to feel. The old bitterness rose like a wave, followed by an emptiness even deeper. He rewrapped the statue, folded the note, and placed the box on the shelf behind him. For the next 3 days, he did not touch it. He continued working, unlocking the door at 8:00, nodding politely to the few residents who trickled in and out. Mrs. Callahan picking up her grandson's birthday card, Ray asking if his pension check had come in early. But something in his rhythm had shifted. He kept hearing a voice from the past, not Eli's, but his father's. A low, measured voice, like gravel wrapped in warmth. People carry anger like it's armor, his father once said, but it only weighs you down. Forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook. It's about setting yourself free. At the time, Samuel had dismissed it as soft. He believed in principles, in fairness, in loyalty. But now, sitting alone in a quiet post office with fading light warming the counters, the words pressed against him like heat through a wool coat. That evening, after locking up, he carried the box home. His house sat just past the creek, tucked behind 2 blue spruce trees. Inside, the rooms were tidy but sparse, the kind of neatness born from living alone. He made tea, sat in the worn armchair near the window, and unwrapped the statue again. The sparrow stared back at him, small, still, chipped. He held it carefully between his palms. In Zen, there's a teaching you cannot fill a closed hand. Samuel didn't know the phrase, but he knew the feeling. The weight of something clenched too long. The tension that becomes part of your body until you forget what ease feels like. He turned the statue slowly, tracing the chipped wing with his thumb. For decades, he had told himself Eli didn't deserve forgiveness, that he had abandoned the family, that he had taken what wasn't his and walked away without looking back. But what if the story wasn't so simple? What if Eli had been hurting too? What if both of them had been too proud to see the sorrow beneath the shouting? He closed his eyes, breathing in the silence. In the distance, coyotes called. The wind shifted through the trees. He placed the sparrow on the windowsill. The next morning, something changed. Instead of unlocking the post office right away, Samuel walked past it and followed the trail that led toward the old barn. The same one where they had argued. The same one where the sparrow had fallen. The path was overgrown, but his feet knew the way. He stood at the doorway, the wooden slats leaning with time. Inside, light spilled through the broken roof in soft beams, catching dust motes that hung like old stories. He sat on the floor, and for the first time in decades, he let himself remember not just the argument, but the days before that. The nights when he and Eli had stayed up whispering about girls and guitars. The day they fixed the roof together. The time they both got caught sneaking pie before supper and blamed it on the dog. He laughed, softly, then cried. Not loudly, not violently, just tears that came without struggle, like rain through broken shingles. Later that week, he wrote back. No email, No phone call, just pen and paper. He didn't say much. Eli, thank you for the gift. I think I finally understand. If you're ever passing through Ridgetop, there's coffee on the porch. Sam. He mailed it the next day. No expectations, just an offering. In Buddhism, there's the idea of dana, the practice of giving without attachment, a gift offered not to receive, but to free the heart, to open the hand. The sparrow still sat on the windowsill, catching light in the afternoons. Samuel didn't know if Eli would write back. He didn't need him to. He had already laid down the weight. Sometimes, the gift is not what is given. It's what is no longer carried. And in that space, empty, open, and light, there is room for something new to take flight. Like a sparrow, unbound, some things arrive not in packages, but in silences like forgiveness or spring. A week after Samuel mailed his letter, halfway across the country, in a quiet coastal town where the fog softened every edge, another kind of reckoning was steeping in a woman's kitchen. The town of Bell Shore was tucked between cliffs and water, and its mornings always came wrapped in mist. If you walked up the slope from the harbor and turned left at the faded green mailbox, you'd find a weathered house with blue shutters, ivy along the eaves, and a small garden that smelled of rosemary and rain. The windows were often open, even in winter. This was where Helen Whitlow lived. She was 74, slim as seagrass, with eyes the color of deep sky and a voice that never rushed to be heard. Before she retired, Helen had taught ceramics at the local high school for nearly 4 decades. Her hands still held the memory of clay, how it resisted at first, then softened under warmth and pressure. She had never been famous, but she had shaped thousands of pieces and thousands of young lives, quietly, one kiln firing at a time. Since retiring, she spent most mornings in the small sunroom off the kitchen, where light filtered through sheer curtains and landed in soft pools on the wooden floor. The shelves lining the walls held rows of hand-thrown cups and bowls, each unique glazed in earthy greens, smoky whites, the occasional splash of cobalt. She drank her tea from the same cup every day, pale gray, with a wide rim and a faint swirl in the glaze like the shape of a rising cloud. It had a crack thin, but unmistakable running from the base almost to the lip. She'd made it her second year of teaching. It had survived 8 moves, a divorce, and the long, slow fade of her parents. Still, it held warmth. She never replaced it. That morning, as rain ticked softly on the glass roof, Helen carried the cup to her low table and sat with her legs folded beneath her. Steam rose gently from the tea, carrying the scent of ginger and lemongrass. She had just finished rereading a letter from her younger sister, Anna. It was written on cream paper in a looping, careful hand. The final line stayed with her. I wish we had talked more after Mom passed. I know we drifted, but it wasn't on purpose. Maybe it never is. Helen folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer beside a spool of red thread and a tiny wooden elephant missing one leg. She didn't cry, but her hand lingered on the drawer a little longer than usual. The rain slowed. She rose and pulled on her boots. She walked down the stone path through her garden. where the air held that particular scent of wet earth and unopened blossoms. She passed the rusted wind chimes near the gate, the rosemary that always overgrew its bed, the bird bath where a single finch stood preening in the gray light. Across the street sat the community center, where she now volunteered twice a week, mostly teaching a ceramics group for seniors who had never touched a wheel before. That afternoon's session had only 4 students: David, recently widowed and prone to making ashtrays he didn't need; Rosa, who told stories with her hands and laughed even when her bowls collapsed; Lena, soft-spoken and shy, who only worked with white clay; and Paul, a retired lawyer who once said he hated mess, but now attended every week. They sat in a loose circle around the wheel, their fingers caked in slip. Helen moved quietly among them, offering guidance without intrusion. Rosa held up a lopsided mug. "I like it," she said. "It looks like it's leaning towards something." Paul raised an eyebrow. "Looks like it's drunk." They laughed. David didn't laugh. He was staring at the broken handle of a teacup he had just shaped. It had cracked during drying. He set it down, frustrated. "It's ruined." Helen sat beside him. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe not." He looked at her, confused. She picked up the broken piece. "You know the Japanese practice of kintsugi." He shook his head. "It means golden joinery. When a pot breaks, they don't discard it. They mend it with lacquer mixed with powdered gold. The crack becomes part of the story." David frowned. "Seems like cheating, hiding the damage." Helen smiled softly. "It's not hiding. It's honoring. The break is what makes it real." She gently handed him back the cup. That evening, after class, Helen stayed behind to clean. The building was quiet. She swept the floor, wiped down the workstations, rinsed the glaze buckets. As she reached for the last sponge, her elbow knocked a bowl off the counter. It hit the tile and shattered. She froze. It wasn't just any bowl. It had belonged to her mother. A pale blue vessel with tiny specks of iron bloom in the glaze. It had sat on their family kitchen table for decades, filled with apples or folded napkins or once. She remembered bright yellow marbles during a long summer they couldn't afford a vacation. She knelt slowly, picking up the pieces. One shard cut her finger. Blood welled, small but vivid. She sat on the floor, back against the counter, the broken bowl in her lap, and she felt the years catch up with her. The words she never said, the birthday she missed, the letter from Anna. A sentence floated up from memory. Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. She had taught that quote in class once, attributing it to the Buddha, though no one knew if he really said it. But in that moment, sitting on a cold tile floor with blood on her finger and ceramic in her lap, she understood it not as a quote, but as truth. She had held onto silence for too long. The next morning, she opened the drawer again. Reread Anna's letter. Then, she picked up her phone. The call rang 4 times before it connected. Hello, Helen's voice trembled slightly. Anna, it's me. A pause. Then Helen. They hadn't spoken in 6 years. The conversation was gentle, hesitant at first, like 2 animals meeting at the edge of a clearing. But then warmth. They didn't rehash old arguments. They didn't explain everything. They just shared memories, quiet laughter, long pauses filled with understanding. After the call, Helen stood by the window, tea in hand, the cracked cup warming her fingers. She looked out at the garden, where the rosemary had begun to bloom. She picked up her mother's broken bowl and began to piece it together, slowly, with care, not with gold, but with presence. And when it was done, and the seams were visible but strong, she placed it on the sunroom shelf, beside the sparrow figurine David had made in class last week. Some things are never the same after they break, but maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is that we still hold them, that we still drink from the cracked cup, that we still call, still mend, still meet what is, exactly as it is. And in that choice, in that quiet, everyday gesture of kindness toward what has been broken, something opens, like a flower in morning light, as Helen's hands moved slowly across the pieces of her mother's bowl. Somewhere far from Bellshore, the wind lifted a thin veil of dust from the earth and carried it across a cracked desert plain, where time had been measured not in hours, but in windstorms. And silence was as old as the mountains themselves. Out in the New Mexico desert, where the sun spilled over stone like hot syrup, and the light changed colors with every passing hour, stood an old bell tower long abandoned, partly crumbled, and rarely visited except by wild birds and the occasional drifting soul who had taken a wrong turn and ended up somewhere they didn't expect. That was exactly what had happened to Joseph Barris. He was 63, tall, broad-shouldered, but softened with time. His once black hair had silvered, not evenly, but in curious streaks along his temples and behind his ears. His hands were strong, though his knuckles ached in the cold, and his voice carried the low hum of a man who'd once spoken for a living, but now rarely raised his voice above a whisper. For 35 years, Joseph had been a field engineer for a utility company based in Colorado Springs. He'd traveled across half the country, fixing downed lines, walking under towers, checking pulse signals, tightening bolts with a kind of reverence reserved for men who understood the weight of small, unseen work. He had always preferred wires to people machines, at least did not pretend. He had taken early retirement 2 months ago, not because he was ready, because his son, David, had stopped answering his calls. They had argued again. It had been a short call, sharp, followed by silence, the kind that sits heavy on your chest even when no one else can hear it. Joseph hadn't known what to do with the sudden stretch of empty time, so he packed his truck with a thermos, a sleeping bag, a few notebooks, and no real destination. He told himself he was just driving for the sake of the open road. But after several days winding through canyons and dry riverbeds, he found himself off route, following a barely there sign that read, Old San Juan Bell, 2 miles, with an arrow pointing toward a dirt path. The road was rough, made more of rock than soil, but he took it anyway. When he reached the end of it, he stepped out into heat that buzzed in the air like electricity. The structure was barely standing, a squat stone chapel with a half-collapsed roof, and beside it, a tall, narrow tower made of aged adobe and worn wood beams. At the top, suspended by rusted iron, hung a single bronze bell silent, streaked with patina and thick with dust. There was no sign of recent human presence. No trash, no footprints, only wind, stone, and sky. Joseph walked toward the bell tower slowly. There was something about it, something unfinished. He didn't go inside. Not at first. He circled the structure, running his fingers lightly along the rough wall, brushing dust from faded symbols carved near the base. An old Spanish mission, perhaps, though there were no plaques, no dates, no names, only the silence. He sat down on a rock facing the bell and poured himself a cup of coffee. The quiet was different out here, not empty, but full, like the space between heartbeats. He stayed until dusk, and then, without meaning to, returned the next day, and the next. He began bringing a small journal, just a few lines each day, not about the bell, not even about David, just thoughts, fragments, the shape of the clouds, the way the light shifted through the opening in the bell tower at exactly 4:15, the fluttering of wings as hawks dipped across the horizon. One afternoon, he noticed a rope, frayed and sun-bleached, still attached to the bell's clapper. Most of it had worn away, but a thin piece remained, curled in the dust, like a question waiting to be asked. He stared at it and felt something stir. He wasn't sure what he expected, but that night he dreamt of David, not as a man, but as a child, sitting on the hood of the truck, eating peanut butter crackers, watching the stars. In the dream, David said nothing, but he was smiling. The next morning, Joseph returned with a length of cord he'd found in the back of his truck. He spliced it carefully, attaching it to the weathered rope, threading it up through the tower using a long piece of conduit as a guide. It took hours. He didn't know why he was doing it, only that it mattered. By sunset, the new rope was in place. He stood beneath it, looking up. Then, without fanfare, he pulled it gently. The bell rang. A low, round sound, not loud, but deep. It filled the space, vibrating through the bones of the tower, through the rock, the sand, the air itself, and something inside Joseph cracked. Not in a painful way, more like a shell finally yielding to what had been pressing from within. He sat down, tears stinging his eyes. He thought of all the things he had never said, the pride he had mistaken for strength, the way his own father had taught him silence as a form of survival, and how he had passed that silence on like an inheritance. In Zen, there is a saying, when the student is ready, the bell rings. He had always thought that meant awakening, but maybe it simply meant listening, not with ears, with heart. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills and the temperature dropped, Joseph built a small fire in the clearing beside the tower. He boiled water for tea and sat with his palms open to the flames. And then he did something unexpected. He spoke aloud. "David," he said softly, "I don't know if you'll ever hear this, but I'm sorry. I was trying to protect you, but I think I was just protecting myself." The wind shifted. A coyote called in the distance. "I'm learning," he continued. "Not fast, not gracefully, but I'm learning." The next morning, he rang the bell again, and again the next day. By the end of the week, the sound had changed. Or maybe he had. The tone seemed richer now, fuller, as if the tower had found its voice again. A few days later, a local rancher passed by on horseback. "First time I've heard that bell in 30 years, the man said, tipping his hat. Joseph nodded. "You the new keeper?" Joseph paused. "No," he said, then smiled faintly. "Just someone passing through." But he stayed another week, then another. Each morning, he swept the dust from the base of the tower. He replaced a cracked beam with spare wood from the back of his truck. He painted a new arrow on the road sign. Not for glory, not for thanks, just because it felt like the right thing to do. One afternoon, he found a folded note tucked beneath a rock by the bell. It was from a woman who'd come to pray. No name, just a sentence. The sound helped me remember what I had forgotten to grieve. He folded the note and tucked it into his journal. That night, he wrote to David. Not a long letter, not a plea, just a few honest lines. "I've been sitting in the desert, listening to an old bell ring. It reminded me of you, of how little I said. I hope you're well. I'm here. If you ever want to talk." He left it unmailed for 3 days. Then, finally, sent it. He didn't wait for a reply. He kept showing up. One morning, while pouring water for tea, he noticed the wind had shifted. It came from the east now, warm and dry. A hawk circled low, casting its shadow across the sand. Joseph pulled the rope gently. The bell rang, clear and sure. And somewhere, deep inside, he understood. The bell didn't ring because someone was lost. It rang because someone was here, listening, still. And perhaps that's all we're ever asked to do, to show up, to ring the bell, and to be present with whatever answers, even if it's silence, even if it's wind, even if it's a long road, leading nowhere in particular, with a sky that stretches forever, and a heart, at last, open, just as the desert wind carried the bell's sound beyond the tower into the open silence. In a different corner of the world, where air was thicker and the earth wore a deeper green, the wind took a gentler shape, one that rustled quietly through maples and drifted across a quiet pond shaded by reeds. In the hills outside of Eugene, Oregon, nestled beyond a gravel road that twisted through dense pine and cedar, lay the old Glen Haven Botanical Sanctuary. It wasn't marked on most maps. The few who came didn't come looking for thrills. They came for quiet, for reflection, for the slow, sacred rhythm of things growing and fading without fanfare. And at the heart of that rhythm was Margaret Lowe. At 71, Margaret had worked at the sanctuary longer than most trees had stood. She wasn't its founder. She would never call herself its caretaker. She preferred the word groundskeeper, as if she were just borrowing the land for a while and wanted to keep it tidy before passing it on. Her hair had turned white in soft waves that curled behind her ears. Her hands were large and strong, with half-moon scars from a lifetime of pruning roses and lifting wet soil. She walked with a slight limp, the result of a hip that had grown tired of pretending to be young. Each morning before dawn, Margaret would open the back gate and begin her rounds. She moved slowly, not from age, but from reverence. Her steps were deliberate, almost ceremonial, especially when walking the meditation trail that curved through the moss-covered stone path behind the greenhouse. The greenhouse itself was small paint peeling from the frame, glass paneled in 1,000 glints of reflection. Inside, Orchids clung to their wooden shelves like secrets waiting to bloom, and succulents basked in morning light as if sipping it through unseen mouths. On this particular morning, the fog had not yet lifted. The trail was quiet. Only the distant chirp of a robin hinted that the world was waking. Margaret paused by the koi pond near the north gate. She fed the fish, bright flashes of orange and gold gliding beneath the surface, and watched a single maple leaf drift gently from a branch and land on the still water. She followed it with her eyes. It spun slightly, touched by the breeze, then slowly drifted across the surface like a thought not yet formed. And something about that movement stirred a memory. It had been 1 year, almost to the day, since Ellie had passed. Ellie had been Margaret's partner for 22 years. Quiet, thoughtful Ellie, who collected seed pods and read poetry aloud when the rains came. They had never married, never needed to. Their love was soft and steady, like the sanctuary itself. And when the cancer came, it came like a winter storm, first a drizzle, then a downpour, then a silence so complete it felt like snow. After Ellie died, Margaret stayed on at the sanctuary, not because she didn't know where else to go, but because this was the only place where grief made sense, where things died all the time and nothing was out of order. But lately, the ache had begun to twist in new ways. It wasn't just missing Ellie. It was the feeling that something had stopped moving inside her. She was still kind, still capable, but beneath it all was a quiet resistance. She hadn't cried in months. She hadn't laughed in longer. That morning, as the fog lifted, she made her way to the Eastern Grove, Ellie's favorite, a narrow clearing surrounded by white birch, with a wooden bench they had placed there together 10 years ago. They had planted a red oak nearby and watched it grow from sapling to shadowmaker. Margaret sat on the bench, facing the tree. She remembered something Ellie once said while brushing fallen petals from the bench. "I think we fear letting go because we think it erases what came before. But really, it just makes room to feel it more clearly." Margaret hadn't understood that back then, but now she sat with it. The bench creaked slightly under her weight. A crow called from the distance, and then she wept. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the slow kind of tears that don't come from thinking, but from something deeper than thought. Later that day, as she walked back to the main trail, she passed one of the volunteers, Jasper, a college student who came on weekends to help prune the elderberry bushes and study mushrooms in the shaded grove. Jasper paused when he saw her. "You okay, Ms. Lowe?" She looked at him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Yeah," she said. "I think I finally let something fall." He blinked, unsure what she meant, but sensing it didn't need explanation. He offered her a paper cup of jasmine tea he had just brewed. They stood in silence, steam curling between them like a shared breath. In Zen, there's a saying, when the leaf falls, the wind does not mourn it. But perhaps, Margaret thought, the wind does pause, just long enough to notice. The next morning, she returned to the meditation trail earlier than usual. She brought nothing but her breath. She walked slowly. The moss underfoot was cool and damp. The sun rose and filtered rays through the canopy. She paused by a patch of wild ginger and knelt to touch its leaves. Nearby, a tiny snail moved slowly across a stone. She watched it for a full minute, for no reason. And in that watching, something opened. A space, a stillness, not the kind that avoids pain, but the kind that sits beside it without trying to fix it. She thought of all the things Ellie had loved that she had ignored since the poetry books in the cedar box. The meditation bell they had bought in Kyoto but never hung. The seeds they had saved but never planted. That afternoon, she opened the box. The bell was smaller than she remembered. Bronze with a red silk cord. The clapper still held a gentle chime, even after years of silence. She dusted it gently and hung it near the red oak in the eastern grove. It swayed slightly in the breeze, did not ring, but held presence. 2 days later, Jasper returned with a bag of flower seeds, lilies, daisies, lavender. "Thought you might want these for the new plot," he said. Margaret hadn't told anyone she was starting a new plot. She just smiled and nodded. They planted the seeds together near the greenhouse. And as they worked, Jasper told her about his grandmother, about how she had raised him on a small farm, taught him to talk to chickens and recognize the language of clouds. She used to say, "Everything's a teacher," he said. Margaret smiled. "She sounds like someone who understood Zen." He blinked. She never called it that. She didn't have to. The wind stirred again. This time it moved the bell. A soft chime. Clear. Small. Enough. That evening, as Margaret closed the gate, she stood for a long time facing the sanctuary. She thought of the leaf on the pond, how it had drifted, not in control, not resisting, just carried. And maybe that was the practice to allow the wind, to notice the falling, and to see in every loss, not just an end, but an invitation to be here, fully, even as things pass. Especially then, just as the leaf turned softly in the still water of the sanctuary pond. Far away, in a colder place, frost clung to the bare branches of maple trees, and the wind sang a different kind of quiet. The town of Harlow's Bend sat curled in the arms of southern Vermont, a place where winter didn't merely arrive, but slowly grew into the bones of things. Snow here did not fall in storms, but in hushes blanketing the rooftops, softening the sounds of passing cars, and slowing even the most hurried of hearts. At the edge of the village, beyond the last row of plowed fences, there was a small gray house with cedar shingles and a long sloping shed out back. The garden was buried under 3 inches of snow, but a few wooden boxes sat in a neat line beside the hedgerow, their tops dusted white. They were beehives, and they belonged to Harold Dempsey. Harold was 76 years old, tall and stooped from decades of lifting mops and moving chairs. He had worked as a school custodian for nearly 40 years. And even now, years into retirement, he moved with the rhythm of someone used to checking locks twice and folding things neatly before leaving a room. He spoke little, except to his bees. He had kept them for most of his adult life, not for honey, though he did sell a few jars at the local co-op, but for the quiet it offered. The hum, the order, the strange, sacred precision of something small working towards something sweet. But winter was different. In winter, the bees clustered deep inside the hives, gathering warmth from each other's bodies. vibrating just enough to keep the queen alive. And Harold, too, stayed quiet. It had been 2 years since his wife, Lillian, passed away. They had shared that little house since they were 23. She had painted the kitchen blue 3 different times. She read the paper aloud even when he pretended not to listen. She called him Harry and insisted that bees could sense human emotion. Some days, he believed her. Other days, he simply moved through the silence like a man walking underwater. On this morning, the sky was slate gray, and Harold was layering on his wool coat and boots. He picked up his walking stick, an old maple branch he had carved with shallow grooves along the handle, and stepped out onto the crunchy snow. The path to the hives was narrow, flanked by dormant blackberry vines and a line of bare-limbed spruce. His breath came in visible puffs, each one drifting upward and dissolving into nothing. When he reached the first hive, he leaned down gently and placed his ear near the side. He listened. A low hum, faint. But there, he exhaled. "They're still with me," he whispered. He moved from box to box, repeating the ritual. At the last hive, he knelt longer. This was Lillian's favorite painted pale yellow, with little white daisies hand-painted around the base. She had named it Lotus. He placed his gloved hand gently against it. No hum. He waited. Nothing. Stillness. He didn't panic. Bees sometimes shifted their cluster, going quiet. But even so, his chest tightened. He traced one of the painted daisies with his finger. In Buddhist teachings, the lotus grows from mud not despite it, but because of it. The flower blooms only when its roots have rested in darkness long enough to draw up the strength to rise. Harold stayed there, crouched in the cold, his hand against the silent box. And for a moment, something in him stilled, not just his body, but the grief that had hummed beneath every chore, every cup of tea, every folding of laundry since Lillian had gone. He stood slowly, brushing the snow from his knees. That afternoon, he brought a small ceramic teapot, one of the few pieces Lillian had made in her pottery class years ago, and placed it on the stove. He brewed chamomile and sat at the table with his wool hat still on, not because he had forgotten, but because the warmth comforted him. He opened the old leather-bound notebook where he'd written hive logs for years. In the margins, Lillian had scribbled poems, haikus, mostly little ones, her way of responding to the world. On the page, marked Hive 5, Lotus, there was one in faded ink. When the hive is still, do not rush to conclusions, even snow breathes slow. Harold read it 3 times. He thought about the way he had lived much of his life, as if silence meant failure, as if stillness meant something was wrong. He closed the book and waited. 3 days later, the wind shifted. The temperature rose slightly. Harold returned to the hives with a stethoscope, an old one a friend from town had lent him years ago when he first began overwintering his bees. He pressed it gently to the side of the yellow box. At first, nothing. Then a faint vibration, so soft he could have imagined it. But no, they were there, just quiet, just surviving. He sat down in the snow, letting the stick fall beside him. He didn't smile, exactly, but the corner of his mouth softened. He remembered something his Buddhist neighbor, Naomi, once told him over tea. In winter, The world is not dead. It is merely listening. He hadn't understood her then. But now, kneeling in snow beside a hive that had seemed lost, he did. That evening, he opened Lillian's box of pottery, a small wooden chest she kept in the hallway closet. Most of it was imperfect. Bowls with uneven lips, mugs with glazed-over chips, tiny figurines of bees and birds that never quite stood straight. He lined them up along the kitchen windowsill, not to display, but to witness. He placed a single votive candle in the cracked cup she had once called her evening moon and lit it. The flame flickered, reflected in the snowy window. In Zen, there is a phrase, sit like a mountain, move like a river. For Harold, sitting had never been hard, but moving, letting things shift, that was the practice now. He returned to the hives daily, not out of worry, but presence. He read aloud from books. He recited Lillian's haikus. He placed sugar water on a small saucer when the temperature climbed above freezing. The bees, when they stirred, danced around him like threads of gold unraveling from the sky. One morning, in early March, a single bee landed on his glove. It sat there, still. He held his breath. Then slowly, it twitched, turned, and lifted off, disappearing into the light. Harold stood motionless, then laughed, quietly, alone, and the sound startled even him. He went inside, poured himself tea, and opened his notebook. On a fresh page, he wrote, "When the hive is still, sometimes the heart needs that too, but spring always comes." And that night, before going to bed, he paused by the window. The snow was melting. A small patch of earth had reemerged near the base of the yellow hive. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And maybe, Harold thought, that's all awakening really is, not an epiphany, but a moment of noticing, of waiting long enough to hear the hum, to let it guide us home. As the snow around the beehives began to thaw and Harold's heart cracked open to spring, hundreds of miles away on the western coast, beneath the pink haze of fog-softened skies, a paper lantern swayed gently from the awning of a small shop tucked into a quiet corner of San Francisco's Japantown. It was early March, and the lantern's colors, red fading into amber, traced with the faded outline of a crane in flight, moved with the ocean breeze that sometimes reached this far inland. A bronze bell above the door jingled faintly as someone passed by, but no one entered. Above the lantern shop, in the attic whose windows faced the side alley and the sloping roof of a neighboring tea house, lived a man named Walter Ishimoto. Walter had turned 70 just a few weeks earlier. He marked the occasion not with cake or visitors, but by putting on his father's old navy blue cardigan and standing silently on the fire escape as the city exhaled below him. His gray hair was still thick, his frame still tall, but time had turned his joints brittle and his steps slower. What he hadn't lost in movement, he had gained in inwardness. He had been a calligrapher for most of his life. Once well known in the Bay Area's Asian arts community, students used to gather in a semicircle around his studio table, watching the brush glide across rice paper with a grace that seemed impossible for hands so weathered. But the last workshop had been nearly 6 years ago. Arthritis had crept into his knuckles like an uninvited guest that wouldn't leave. The lantern shop downstairs belonged to Naomi, his niece, who had inherited the family business. She sold hand-painted lanterns in every size and color, crafted with bamboo ribs and delicate paper, the kind that seemed to glow even without light. Walter helped when he could, mostly stringing chords, advising on designs, or writing the kanji characters that customers often requested. But most of the time, he stayed in the attic. It wasn't out of bitterness, just habit. He kept a single room tidy with monk-like precision, wooden floors swept, futon rolled each morning, teapot rinsed after every use. A framed scroll hung on the eastern wall. He had painted it himself years ago. The single character, brushed in ink-black stroke, read mu, emptiness, or nothingness, not a void, but the space where something new might enter. Every morning, Walter rose just before dawn. He sat by the attic window with his tea, roasted barley, no sugar, and watched the alley fill slowly with the scent of rising steam from the noodle shop next door. Pigeons gathered near the gutters. Neon signs flickered into rest, and somewhere behind it all, life unfolded without needing him to steer. That morning, as cherry blossoms began appearing along the main avenue, Naomi knocked softly at his door. "Uncle," she said, "I know you don't usually go out much, but there's something I think you might like." Walter looked up from his folded newspaper. She stood in the doorway, holding a flyer. "It's a temporary exhibit," she said. "Zen Gardens. Minimalist sculpture. It's at the Asian Art Museum this month." He hesitated. Crowds were tiring now, even small ones, but something in Naomi's face, hopeful, soft, like his sister's once, was made him pause. He nodded. Perhaps. The next morning, they walked together towards Civic Center. He wore his father's cardigan again, though the sleeves hung looser now. Naomi carried a thermos of genmaicha in her bag. The sidewalks were damp from last night's rain, and the scent of wet stone lingered in the air. At the museum, they entered a quiet wing filled with raked gravel gardens, low wooden benches, and soft lighting that made the space feel more like a temple than a gallery. One exhibit caught Walter's eye, a sculpture, simple, almost nothing, a single rock, polished smooth, placed atop a wooden platform dusted with white sand. Beside it, a small plaque read, "The mountain does not speak, yet it teaches the cloud how to pass." Walter stood still. He thought of his mother, who used to tend a small garden behind the family's corner shop when he was a boy. He remembered how she would stop mid-weeding to watch the way shadows moved across a stone. He remembered the silence of it. After a long while, he sat on a nearby bench. Naomi sat beside him. They didn't speak, and it was perfect. Later that night, back in his attic room, Walter opened the lacquer box that had sat untouched in his closet for years. Inside were brushes, some soft and worn, others still wrapped in silk, bottles of sumi ink, a small porcelain water dish shaped like a plum blossom, and a stack of rice paper, still clean. He hadn't touched them since the pain in his fingers became constant. But tonight, he simply laid them out. Not to use, just to see them again, like visiting an old friend. That week, he returned to the museum twice, not to see new things, to revisit the rock. He came at the same time, sat in the same place, and let the sculpture teach him how to sit without fixing. observe without naming. At home, he began sketching again, not with brush and ink, with pencil, light strokes, shapes of clouds, spirals, a tea kettle, a leaf. Naomi noticed. She brought him fresh rice paper one afternoon, and a single flower, camellia. Walter said nothing, but he placed the flower in the old sake bottle he used as a vase. That evening, he wrote a single line beside his window. Today I did nothing, and yet the sky kept changing. The following Sunday, Naomi closed the shop early. They prepared tea together. As the kettle hissed softly and the steam rose, she asked gently, "Do you miss teaching?" He paused, pouring water into the small clay pot. "I used to think I missed being needed," he said, "but now I wonder, maybe what I really missed was the quiet that came afterward." Naomi nodded. She poured the tea carefully into 2 small cups. "I've always wondered how you stay so calm." He smiled faintly. "I don't." Then he looked toward the window, but I let the storm pass through. Outside, the fog thickened. The bell above the lantern shop door jingled faintly. They drank in silence. As dusk deepened, Walter stood and retrieved the box of calligraphy tools. His hands still hurt, but something in him had shifted. He unrolled a fresh scroll, not to impress, not to perform, but to be with the stroke, to meet the line as it curved, not before, not after, just as it did. He dipped the brush and began again in the space above the shop. The lantern swayed once more, now reflected in a pane of glass where an old man practiced returning to now. And somewhere, the quiet grew one breath wider. The story you just heard is not meant to be remembered as entertainment, but as a mirror quietly offering a reflection of something you may already carry inside. In Zen, the greatest realizations come not with fireworks, but with a soft understanding, like morning mist lifting from the hillside. Whether it was the silence between words, the turning of a character's heart, or a single breath taken with awareness, these moments are doorways, not to another world, but to this one, seen clearly. As we continue this series of 100 Zen-inspired tales, we invite you not just to listen, but to live alongside them. Let their stillness become your stillness. Let their questions echo in the spaces where your own answers are still forming. And if you felt something stir during this story, an image, a memory, a forgotten feeling, share it in the comments below. Your reflection might help someone else see their path more clearly. If you haven't already, please like this video, subscribe to Cosmic Zodiac, and join our growing circle of listeners seeking peace, clarity, and compassion through story. Until the next one, may you carry today's lesson not as knowledge, but as a lantern, softly lighting your way forward.